Hello, everyone. Justin Vacula here with another episode of the Stoic Philosophy Podcast. Today's episode is a discussion about humility with guest Dr. Regan Lance Reitsma. Visit my website at justinvacula.com, where you can find links to my social portals, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and see past content on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. Support me on my new patreon.com page, on which I offer several rewards. Please share, comment, like, and subscribe. I explore the tradition of Stoicism with goals to inform, empower, and help others benefit from the practical wisdom of ancient Greek, Roman, and modern thinkers, including Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. Today's guest, Dr. Reitsma, received a Philosophy Ph.D. in 2007 from The Ohio State University and obtained a bachelor's degree from the Departments of Philosophy and Classics from Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He serves as assistant professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He specializes in moral psychology, practical rationality and practical normativity, tolerance, and moral rights. He also includes philosophy of religion, ethical theory and applied ethics, social and political philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, Hume and Kant, and sports in his areas of competency. Find his work at kings.edu and academia.edu. See links in the show notes. All right, on to today's conversation. Thank you for joining me for discussion today.
Thanks for having me, Justin. I'm glad you're still active after being a student at King's in the philosophical world and thinking about big ideas. So I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks for your time today in talking. So we'll talk about the topic of humility today. You've written some papers on this topic. How would you define humility?
Actually, the way that I kind of want to think about my definition of humility is to see mine in contrast with a couple of other notions of humility. My kind of quick phrasing for what I think humility is, that it's a form of disinterested obedience or a kind of willingness to submit to a perceived normative authority. Those sound kind of abstractly philosophical and need to be elaborated. And so, again, it kind of, I think, is useful to think about a couple of other notions of humility, and then I like mine to kind of pop out in contrast. And then maybe you can see some of the advantages of my account in the process. And so, there's kind of two accounts that in my writings, for instance, and in my thinking, I've been mildly critical of. One is a kind of notion of humility as being a sense of lowliness or a sense of one's own weaknesses or failures.
Right.
And the representative for that view, Comte-Sponville, a French philosopher, and I'll just call him Sponville from now on. Mm. And then there's a second account by a philosopher named Robert Roberts. He treats humility as a matter of living out a deep recognition of the basic moral equality and worth of each person. Living out a sense that you do matter, but you don't matter morally any more or any less than any other person. And so those are the two accounts I want to contrast mine with. And you might notice that the first account, Sponville's account, which he especially stresses that humility is a matter of recognizing your own moral weakness, your own lack of virtue, or it's a kind of even a kind of deeply informed contempt for your own moral character. And he will use language as strong as contempt for your own moral character.
Right.
His view is you might call a vertical view. There's the standard, the moral law, say, and when you and I reflect on our character in light of the moral law or some kind of idealistic moral standard like the biblical principle of love your neighbor as yourself, we just come up so terribly short. Our character looks pathetic and weak in comparison with this ideal, and it's a sense of that shortcoming that constitutes humility. And again, that's kind of a vertical thing. There's a standard that above us, as it were, that we fail to live up to, and humility is recognizing how and being very dissatisfied with oneself in one's moral failures.
Right.
The Roberts account, you might notice has a kind of horizontal element to it. It's a matter of saying, I'm a human being and I matter morally, but I don't matter any more or less than any other human beings. And so Robert talks about having our feet on the ground. Man means a person of the red earth or something in that order, that we all are, we should have our feet on the ground. We should think we're important, but no more or less important than anybody else. We shouldn't be up in the clouds looking down condescendingly, say, on other people or treating people as though they didn't matter as much as us. And he thinks we have a tendency to mistreat people that way or to get kind of entangled in and psychologically in this kind of sense of measuring how we're doing compared to everyone else, and then feeling, a negative moral emotions about other people, haughtiness or condescension towards people we think are lower than us, or feeling weak and pathetic and worthless in comparison to people we think are better than us. And so he wants to treat, again, humility as on a horizontal plane. You recognize your own moral worth, but you don't overstate or understate that worth in comparison to other people. So he has a horizontal picture. And I want to construe a third picture that's also as vertical in character, but it's not Sponville's view, and it's not grounded in the kind of sense of our lowliness or weakness or some sense of our failing. Part of the grounds that I think people can be successful and humble. They can recognize their own successes and be humble. And so anyhow, that's the kind of the architecture for how to think about my definition of humility. Is I want to, like Sponville, have a vertical account. And I think that historically, it's been hard for people to shake the sense that humility does have a vertical character, that humility has something to do with recognizing something above yourself. But again, I don't want Sponville's account, and I have, though I admire much of what Roberts has to say and find it very insightful, I want to raise some criticisms for his view too. So that's some architecture anyhow, but that can be fleshed out.
Right. So having some positive views of it, not of this corresponding sadness, as he talks about following a moral failing or something we recognize about ourselves, right?
That's right. Yeah, so Sponville also talks about following Spinoza partly. Spinoza has the idea that humility is a kind of recognition of one's own weakness, but in particular, the recognition that there's so much in the world that you and I have zero power over, zero control over. Right. And so we're this kind of small creature in this vast universe, and there's very little we control, just our own character and decisions. He's got kind of a Stoic theme in Spinoza. And so that sense of one's own powerlessness and impotence in the vastness of the world, that's what he identifies as humility. And Spinoza says there's a truthful sadness. We really are recognizing something true when we see our impotence, but it makes us sad, right? I mean, we desire greater control than we have. And then, Sponville picks up on that and moralizes that, in comparison also to the moral law, we come up so short and feel kind of truthful, honest sadness about our own character.
Right. So, and with the Stoics, there's humility in that, and realizing that, yes, well, the world is much bigger than us. We don't have all the answers. And yes, there are a lot of things outside of our control. So what attitude can we have in response to that? It's perhaps an attitude of acceptance, gratitude, and yes, humility, as we're talking about. We have a quote from Seneca here. Seneca writes, "There is no reason why you should put confidence in yourself too quickly and readily. Examine yourself, scrutinize yourself, observe yourself in divers ways, but mark before all else whether it is in philosophy or merely in life itself that you have made progress." Right.
Though that doesn't sound exactly like Sponville, it does have a kind of a recognition of one's own lowliness or impotence in it, right? When you and I think we really understand the world, we should step back and ask, do we really understand it? Are we really as smart, thoughtful, accomplished as we think we are, right? There's a kind of, it's natural to call that humility, and it does kind of fit in the vertical conception of humility that treats humility as a sense of one's own lowliness in some sense. So
maybe we can look back in life to perspectives that we've changed, new ideas that we've learned, different experiences that we've had, and maybe we can recognize that, well, maybe a few years from now, our perspectives will change, so we can be diligent, we can be observant, and have that attitude of, yes, I'm willing to take in new information, adjust my ideas, hang a question mark at the end of things, right? That's the intellectual side of it.
Right, yeah. So it is. I think it's useful at some point for us to talk a little bit too about intellectual humility, and maybe even how it's going to end up fitting in my thoughts about humility more generally. But intellectual humility seems like a very important trait, and we might wonder, how does Sponville's account or how does Roberts' account handle or relate intellectual humility on the one hand and maybe moral humility on the other? And so I want to suggest that my account's going to kind of treat intellectual humility as very similar in structure to moral humility, and I think that's an advantage. Now, one more little piece of kind of architecture here for our conversation. I don't really have the view that there's like one notion of humility, and if there's three competing concepts, one can be right and the other two are false, or so it's just a competition here. I think that Sponville's account has, and Spinoza's, and a number of accounts have some real merit and insight, and I certainly think, as I mentioned a moment ago, that Robert's account has a lot of insight as well. One place you can find Robert's account, by the way, is in an article called "Humility is a Moral Project," I think it's called. And anyhow, there's a lot of psychological insight. But one question that kind of we have to ask is, what would we like our notion of humility to do? Like, what kind of work do we want our concept or account of humility to do? And I see myself as wanting to construct a notion of humility that kind of fits with a long-standing tradition of thinking about humility that goes back into Jewish and Christian sources, in the very least, and conceivably, I think, into Stoic sources. Humility was, for a time, thought to be not only a moral virtue and a personal strength, and a virtue that's consistent with other virtues that we might develop, like patience and tolerance and generosity, but that it's also an especially important virtue, maybe even a cardinal virtue. And the word the phrase cardinal virtue generally means a virtue upon which other virtues hinge. It'd be very difficult to generate a number of other virtues without some particular cardinal virtue. And so I want to suggest that my account of humility can construe humility in a way that it does appear to be a cardinal virtue. And then if the Christian tradition wants, at least some elements of the Christian tradition wants to say that humility is maybe even a primordial virtue. If pride is the primordial vice, the pride is the source of the fall, as it were. Presumably, at least sometimes humility has been seen as its antidote, the opposing virtue that corresponds to the vice of pride. For all the virtues of Sponville's account, of Robert's account, the kind of humility that I want to generate actually does make sense of calling it not just a virtue, not just a personal strength, a virtue consistent with other virtues, but also that it has advantage of painting humility as a cardinal virtue with an especial kind of deep significance. And so anyhow, it's not so much that I'm trying to win over, beat Sponville or beat Roberts in some, duel for the single best theory of humility. But in this case, I think my account has a couple of advantages, that it does some work that I'm not sure that their accounts are going to do.
What might some benefits be of your approach?
So one of the advantages I think that my account has, again, I haven't really said very much about it yet. One of the advantages is that my account, I think, doesn't lead to some of the paradoxes that Sponville's account leads to. So Sponville doesn't hide this. In fact, he kind of wonders a couple of times whether there's something paradoxical about humility. So one question he asks at one point, and I don't think he's the first person to raise this kind of question, but would it be possible for there to be a person who knows he's humble and remains humble, right? Who recognizes his own humility and stays humble even as he does.
Right.
And so it feels like, if humility is a matter of recognizing your own faults, and now you recognize your own humility, and humility is a strength, how does that fit together, right? There seems like some kind of paradox there. Mm-hmm. I want to first point out that that's going to be a problem only for an account of humility that treats humility as recognizing your weaknesses. Right.
How we're going to define
If you think being humble is a matter of recognizing your weakness, and now what you're doing is recognizing seemingly a strength, your character trait of humility. Paradox. I'm going to suggest that problem goes away if we move to a notion of humility that doesn't treat humility as a profound, strong sense of how lowly your moral character is. So, part of the problem with Sponville is so censorious, so condemning of our characters and his own, that it really gets him into trouble. Being humble is a matter of feeling profound dissatisfaction with yourself. Oh, but if you feel this profound dissatisfaction with yourself, can you notice that you have this good character trait of noticing how poor your character? So there's this kind of paradox that arises, and there's a second paradox that arises for Sponville too. He presumably thinks that we can improve in the moral life, that we can get better. at least modestly better. In fact, he wrote a whole book called The Small Treatise on the Great Virtues.
Right.
And the point of the book is to help us kind of pull ourselves up a little bit by little to being better people, more generous, more just, more patient, more tolerant, more humble, presumably. He has a whole chapter on humility. And so he thinks that we can get better. But if humility is a matter of recognizing profoundly how poor your character is, it looks like any of us who get any better handsome virtue, become a little bit more honest, a little bit more just, would have to become correspondingly less humble, right?
Right. You'd be more confident.
Or we'd have to, lie to ourselves about our improvement to stay humble. Think we're not improving even as we are. And again, those are kind of strange elements of his theory, right? Just they flow out of the thought that humility is a profound sense, in his case, of our lowly character. I think that we can improve, if modestly, in terms of our character. When we do, I don't think it's wrong to notice that. And I don't think when we become better and notice it that we've necessarily lost humility. Our humility starts to die. So I think my account's going to escape some of his kind of paradoxical character. And so, though I want to keep the idea that being humble has something to do with recognizing something above yourself, it's not fairly anyhow a law that you've failed to live up to or a moral ideal you've failed to live up to. So again, one of my advantages of my account is it doesn't going to lead to these kind of problems. And if you search the philosophical literature, there's kind of a cottage industry of discussions of the paradox of humility or the incoherence of humility. Another problem for Sponville, it turns out, is that he's just so condemning. He makes us sound like dirt, and there's questions about whether he over-dramatizes our moral weaknesses.
These things that might be above ourself, perhaps it's our community, perhaps it's our ideals, as you said, sort of moral
right.
law, certain standards that we might have, maybe affiliation to a certain group. And we can be humble in this and recognizing, well, there are different competing interests in the world. We're just part of that. It's not just us.
Right, and you're coming pretty close to what I want to say about humility is that I want to claim that, at least again, a really important form of humility is a matter of noticing that there are these standards or demands or normative authorities or ideals that we really ought to live up to. It's kind of our task to live up to them. You can see the vertical character in that, right? There's this kind of sense that, well, again, whether it happens to be a particular moral ideal or it's, society's expectations, or it's a notion of justice, or the rights of other people, or a set of intellectual demands, like the demands that are placed on scientists in the work that they do. In my view, humility is crucially, centrally, a matter of recognizing the authoritative status of that ideal or norm or demand, and then submitting to it, being willing to live up to those demands. And so, for instance, to give an example, you could imagine some very well-regarded scientist who has an excellent public reputation and a long history of having published work in good places. And it turns out that one of his grad students, she recognizes a mistake in some of his published work. And let's say that the way he reacts to that is he says, "She's right. I blew it. I made a mistake here," right? And in that case, one of the, excellent things about that particular scientist's behavior here is at some possible cost to his public reputation, he's willing to sort of say, hey, the expectations of scientific discipline, their expectations on me too. And if I've been found to make a mistake, just like any other scientist, I should own up to that, fess up to it, correct it, acknowledge it, and so again, that's kind of natural in my mind to call that an act of of humility, and it also has a vertical character, a kind of sense that I owe it for these standards, live up to them, not to hide my mistake to save my reputation, not to arrogantly assume that they don't apply to me in the same way they apply to graduate students, what have you. So that starts to get at my notion of humility as being disinterested obedience, in this case, obedience to the scientific strictures, and disinterested in the sense that scientist isn't treating his own reputation or welfare or standing as giving over much prejudice to it. He sometimes has to take a hit. Not that you always have to take a hit to be humble, but sometimes it's about living up to the standards, even if that's going to cost us a bit. And so it shows a kind of act of will, a willingness to submit
Right, a sort of sacrifice and being willing to actually make that rather than just brushing something off or, oh, this doesn't apply to me or, oh, it's not such a big deal, maybe trying to minimize it in a way, right?
And so in my view, like contrary to Sponville's view, for instance, in my view, you can think it's my job to live up to this standard, and I have, right? Let's say that there are, expectations that you not perjure yourself in court, that you be honest on and you do. In my view, that's consistent with describing your behavior as humble. If you sort of disinterestedly, like not taking your own interest too strongly into account, treat those standards of honesty as binding upon you, and you do tell the truth, you've been humble in the Reitsma sense, right?
Right.
Not the Sponville sense doesn't apply here. You haven't failed to live up to the relevant standard, right? So, you can go back to the Seneca quotation you gave a moment ago too, and you can see the same kind of mixture of Sponville and Reitsma attitudes. I think in Seneca's quote, he has a kind of sense that, hey, it's my job to live up to the demands of understanding the world around me and all the requirements of evidence gathering and careful weighing and imagining different possibilities, some of which seem more true and some of which seem less true to me, and then saying, well, how am I doing? Right? So there's the kind of Reitsma sense of humility, and it's my job to actually be honest here, and honest with myself and honest with people around me, honest about my intellectual capacities and so on, and it's my job to live up to these standards. And then he also says, oh, and by the way, we all oftentimes fall pretty darn short and shouldn't be too terribly impressed with ourselves. And that's little voice of Sponville popping out there, right?
There's themes throughout the Stoic texts of focusing on one's character, as this is one of the most important things, if not the important things, that we're not going to sell out and compromise our values for maybe gains of wealth, of political power, of pleasing others, that it's going to be more important, that if we compromise our character, then that's going to be really the end of us.
One way to translate the insight you just articulated, and kind of my terminology, is to say that there's a profound humility in the commitment of moral integrity in the Stoic outlook, right? I shouldn't worry too much about this, that, or the other thing. I should do what's right because it's right? And that's an expression of Reitsma's style humility, where I mean by that, not that I am that humble, but that's the kind of count I'm giving. So.
And maybe people will think, oh, well, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, and that maybe, they won't have much consideration for their actions if they don't see it. Maybe they'll partake in some sort of system. Oh, well, everybody else is doing it, so I might as well do it too. It's no big deal. Or they'll ignore certain things in their communities. Oh, it's not in my backyard. But then when it comes to them, then maybe they'll complain then. Right.
Yeah, the Stoics, and I guess you could say, I mean, I haven't thought about it, putting it this way, is that they hold a philosophy anyhow that you should be your own most significant critic, right? Or your own most significant evaluator. So you shouldn't, this follows Socrates kind of line. So you shouldn't be thinking most about what your enemies or your friends or your fellow citizens think. You should do what's really you think right. There's that kind of commitment to integrity there. And it's one that's not grounded in a kind of overmuch concern about reputation, for instance. And so even as everybody thinks Socrates is doing silly things, he thinks it's the right thing, he does it. Even if Crito is pestering him, saying, nobody expects you to do anything other than escape from the cell, Socrates might say, well, you're right, but I just don't think it's the right or best thing for me to do. So, again, there's a kind of, certainly those kind of characters, that reading of Socrates, a centerpiece of Stoic thinking, are going to treat humility of the variety I'm talking about as very important, right? Recognizing, in the Stoic view, by reason, recognizing valid standards, and then submitting. Yeah, so one thing is, we might think historically for a little bit. We've talked about the Stoics. We might think a little bit historically about the notions of humility as well. Why in the Jewish and Christian, or maybe even especially some level of Christian tradition, has humility been such an important, regarded as such an important character trait? Why has the notion of humility kind of lost some of its, there's kind of a nervousness, I think, in the contemporary scene about humility. And I think some of your questions you sent me, mention this. Can you be proud and humble at the same time? Some people worry, isn't self-esteem and pride, aren't those good things? And so, okay, I should be humble, but is it really so healthy for me to be too humble? Those are kind of nervous thoughts that I think ordinary, everyday people have. And I'd like to have some advice about that. And already there's some considerable, maybe we might say philosophical or moral nervousness about humility that pops up when you get to Hume and Kant. And it's kind of an interesting question to think about why that might be. Why might have been the case that humility had to be a little bit overstating, historically seen as such a central, important, fundamental, maybe cardinal or even primordial virtue in the Christian tradition. Why did a nervousness about that idea arise? And one kind of account you might give is that Kant, though his actual views about humility are fairly complex, is one of those people who gets a bit nervous about humility. And so, he's writing at a time where there's this enhanced sense of not only the importance of the individual, the moral importance of the individual, although that has deep roots in Stoicism, but also in Christianity, but also the deep importance of autonomy, of self-governance. And so, Kant will stress this, is that you need to make certain that you don't bow to any external heteronymous authority, right? You may well choose to follow, say, the dictates of God, but it had better be the case that you legislate the maxim, obey the dictates of God for yourself, otherwise you'll be guilty of heteronomy, being governed by another, an external other, rather than by self, autonomy. You might choose to live up to the standards of your, say, community or family or listen to the demand of a general or something like that, but you need to legislate for yourself the maxim behind that command. Right. And so he's very concerned about governance. And you can see how that might start to raise concerns about humility, especially if humility is some kind of willing submission or disinterested obedience. That will raise the question for Kant, obedience to what?
Right. And we don't want a blind obedience or obedience to an unjust thing and participating in unjust actions because others simply say so, right? Right. And Kant himself does treat something as authoritative, for instance, reason, right? And so the moral law has authority over you and I. We ought to respect the moral law, have a kind of reverence for it, obey it, but not because it just, sits in the sky or something like that, but because it's grounded in reason, and we are by nature rational creatures. And so it has a kind of mooring in reason, and we owe our allegiance to reason. And so even in Kant, there is a kind of, willingness to submit to something that has authority, reason, although he wants to tie that to our essential nature and the moral law as well. And so, but, it's kind of a nervousness arises in Kant that then in Kantians continued, and even when Kant talks about, using the Latin term, moral humility, he doesn't treat that as a virtue. A recognition, he treats it as a recognition of the shortcomings of your character compared in comparison with the moral law. And Sponville picks up on this, by the way. I mean, he kind of quotes Kant approvingly about this. And so Kant wants to say that sense of one's own lowliness is a crucial step on the way to feeling the adequate respect for the moral law and then standing up like a real human being, stiff of spine, not groveling, and living accordingly. Mm-hmm. He has kind of Stoic elements to his thinking here as well. It's very steeply St. Paul-style thoughts. Anyhow, he ends up, but when he talks about moral humility, he treats it as a kind of stepping stone to moral goodness, rather moral righteousness, rather than a virtuous trait itself, because it has this kind of I don't live up, I don't measure up character to it, a kind of Sponville-like view. And Kant played a role, but there are other factors that play roles too that started to raise questions about is humility a trait that's too groveling, too being filled with a sense of your own lowliness or weakness? How much do we like that? Maybe we were kind of troubled by it. So though it might have some advantages, is it really an important or a crucial character trait or moral virtue? Is it even purely good character trait, or is it a kind of a mixed character trait that's not really a full virtue? It took some hits, humility, and again, you can even look at the contemporary literature. In about the last 15 years, there's been a lot of writing about humility kind of finally popping up again after a dead period, and it raises these kinds of worries. So Right, so maybe some moderation and, oh, well, I'm not clueless, there's no guide, but there is some standard out there, maybe somewhere in between that.
Right. And then to agree that, some modern philosophical thinking wants to say that, hey, everything's up in the air. There are no standards that you have to follow just because. You should construct your own standards. You should follow your own desires. You should make, Hume's line is that, reason is and only ought to be the slave of the passions. They're the ultimate ruling authority over how you ought to live. Or, some versions, if not Kant himself, of Kantianism that suggests that you ought to construct all your own values. You really determine what's binding and valid for you. These kind of things are going to be ideas that can start to seem inimical to my notion of humility, right? That if humility is a matter of recognizing the authority of certain standards or treating as authoritative standards that you regard as binding upon you and then submitting accordingly, behaving as though they are authoritative. If there are no authorities, everything's up to you. If you're constructing all your own norms and ultimate authorities, well then there is no humility or no sensible good humility in the sense that I'm suggesting. So
that could be a dangerous path as well. If there's this idea, well, what if the standards that you pick out are, well, I'm going to harm people for the fun of it. There's nothing to stop me from doing that. Kind of the extreme or big gun objection here, right? Or the whole system is corrupt, so I'm just going to take it all down and everybody's going to suffer along with me. People might take that kind of response as well. Yeah,
so we could talk a little bit about some of those kind of practical implications here. I was trying to think a little bit about where do we see the style, in what places do we see in our contemporary scene, online, for instance, or even in the media, or in everyday conversations. Where do we see a lack of the kind of humility that I'm trying to gesture at? And one thing you can think about how frustrated scientists these days, understandably, I think, get when they're in conversations, whether it's about climate change or it's about other empirical questions, that they've studied very carefully, that they've made certain that they've read up on and analyzed, only to have somebody wander along and say, yeah, but I have my own view about this. An unwillingness to treat people who are experts as experts and then say, my views are as valid as yours.
Right.
I see those kinds of I can toss onto a blog or onto the web or into a conversation any of my old thoughts, and they're as valid as anyone else's, even the thoughts of experts, is a kind of failure to live up to some important intellectual norms, for instance, of needing to have evidence for your views, at least these kinds of views, as needing to know what you talk about before you toss your opinion out as important as anyone else's in the conversation. And so there's a kind of arrogance in that kind of sloppy rejection of true intellectual authority, right? Where by scientists of being intellectual authority, they don't mean that they can't be wrong or whatever this goes, but that they have a kind of special weight in these conversations, and they're not granted that oftentimes. And I can understand their frustration. James already raises this in The Will to Believe, where he talks about besotted little sentimentalists casually dismissing the hard work of scientists to believe whatever it is they feel like they want to believe, because it comforts them, say. So anyhow, we can see some of our current contemporary frustrations in the light of a lack of humility, a lack of willingness to submit to legitimate intellectual expectations.
Right. Where we have with the internet troves and troves of information, access to experts on topics who have more informed opinions, right? We also get, as you said, people just putting anything forth and, flat earth ideas are coming up and, don't vaccinate your kids because that's going to give them autism, right? Some of these more popular views that are coming nowadays.
And if those people have not, put themselves through the same rigors in the formation of their judgments and opinions, there might be other objections to make to that, but I also see in that a lack of the relevant kind of humility, a lack of a willingness to obey the relevant standards, as it were. So,
right. So a recognition that, well, there are systems, there are experts out there who investigate these ideas. And like you said, yes, maybe they could be wrong. Maybe some of the information might be off, but how are we going to investigate these ideas? Should we defer to these experts, and what standards do they have, right? So maybe a recognition of your idea of humility there, recognizing that, yes, there is a system of standards. Yes, there are people who have more education than I do who are more qualified to speak on these topics.
Yeah, and we can see another kind of broad cultural reason for kind of nervousness about humility too. If this is the right analysis of our contemporary time, it might be also a correct analysis of other times, such as Athens, in which Socrates lived, and any number of other ones. But if, for instance, there's kind of prevailing nervousness about to what we owe commitment, to what we owe allegiance, to what standards or, purported authorities we ought to really be willing to submit. Well, if you can't figure out what it is you have your allegiance to, you're going to have a hard time behaving humbly in light of So if there's 7 different things and you're not sure which of them to commit to, 7 different ideals, say, and you don't know which one to commit to, it's very hard to exemplify humility. You disinterestedly obey, disinterestedly submit to ideals that you haven't really, when you don't have any that you've kind of with some stability committed yourself to. And again, it's kind of a going analysis of our times, that there's a kind of crisis of authority, a kind of crisis of, what should we really commit ourselves to how should we live our lives? Again, to the degree there's a kind of anxiety culturally or in particular individuals about that, there's going to be, it's going to undermine the ability to kind of exemplify humility. So, I mean, again, those are some ways in which, humility kind of, bumps into modern life. Either we don't know how, what standards to live to, and so how do you exemplify humility of the variety, or we get frustrated with folks who don't submit themselves to any, say, intellectual norms of the obviously relevant ones, and here we are. And so anyhow, those are some manifestations of how I'd analyze contemporary trends in light of my picture of humility.
Mm-hmm. And it's in Seneca's letters. He has a letter titled On the Degeneracy of the Age, in which he talks about how vices are throughout time, that it's not just something of today, but it's of all times. He writes, "You are mistaken, my dear Lucilius, if you think that luxury and neglect of good manners and other vices of which each man accuses the age in which he lives are especially characteristic of his own. No, they are the vices of mankind and not of the times. No era in history has ever been free."
Yeah, I hope my comments didn't look like I think we're we're just in a everything's going to hell in a handbasket right now, and everything's bad.
Yeah.
And probably there's some truth to the certain kinds of vices probably crop up in most any age in any corner of the world. And there's probably probably as societies and cultures undergo changes, they probably add new vices and are prone to add new virtues and are prone to new vices. But again, I was trying to kind of link my notions of humility to several contemporary worries.
There could be a sense of disillusionment today, maybe with politics, and that one had placed their allegiance with a certain political figure or party, and then they found, oh, well, hey, there are actually problems with this, and I don't know where to stand. Look, there are all these extremists out there. There are these views that I disagree with. Maybe things didn't go the way I had planned, so maybe people will just go on their own there, or just question their status or what their allegiance is toward. Maybe certain heroes or role models they have had that they've fallen out of grace for whatever reason. Maybe that could be a more modern thing, or even a perennial concern as well.
Right. Yeah, I get asked with some frequency when I talk to people about humility, don't you think we lack, don't you think we have less humility today than we used to? And I don't really know whether we do or not, in the kind of broad judgment, but I think oftentimes what people are responding to when they, make that remark or ask me that question is things like I'm pointing to, like, everybody, so many people express an extra frustration with political conversation, and kind of increasing frustration with it, for instance. And I'm wondering if, again, that some of that is generated by this sense that, this kind of distrust of authority, distrust of institutions, that degree from Brown doesn't matter, and chemistry doesn't matter anything any more than an online degree in chemistry, what have you, right? these kind of things play a role in there, right? You feel like, I get frustrated, and part of my way of articulating it is, I think certain people have submitted themselves to educations and standards and great durations of thinking that others haven't. And so that conversation, the person who has more expertise, more background, that person's judgment should weigh more. And it's arrogant of the person who hasn't to suppose his view is as important. I'm trying to make those kind of links at the moment.
Right. Okay, so to go back to an earlier moment in the conversation, you talked about combining the virtues of pride and humility. Can you talk about that?
Here we do need kind of a set of different notions of pride and a set of different notions of humility, I think. And I think we can isolate a notion of humility, as I've been suggesting, that's it's a moral virtue, kind of a willingness to submit to what you take to be a valid moral standard. I think that's a virtue. I think it's even, as I've been suggesting, a cardinal virtue. How can you be just, temperate, respect the rights of others, be sensibly generous, fair-minded, unless you're willing to submit to various moral standards of justice and rights and so on? And so you can see how the form of humility I'm talking about is a cardinal virtue. You'll struggle to have other virtues, patience, say, unless you're willing to submit to certain moral standards. And I want to suggest the notion of humility I have here does actually is the antidote for a form of pride that is morally pernicious. Now, I don't know that there's anybody who lives out full-bodied all the way through his or her life this form of pride. So it's not that I have a person in mind who exemplifies this notion of pride. But let's say you had a person who says, I'm God in the following sense. I get to decide everything, right? I get to decide what matters and what doesn't. I get to decide what intellectual norms are valid for me, what aren't. I get to decide what moral standards are valid or not. Nothing whatsoever. I will submit to nothing. And so, this is why in some of my writing I said, if you want to talk theologically about humility, like Sponville does, for instance, and to some degree Roberts does, I'm happy to do it. The notion of pride here, the kind of unwillingness to treat anything as an authority over you, you can try to go back to the story of the fall, or to the kind of theological reflection on the fall of Satan that folks like Anselm engage in, and they want to suggest that there's a kind of primordial pride and unwillingness to submit to and what's taken to be a valid authority, God's will, whose antidote would presumably be the kind of humility I'm talking about, a sense that there are things that are above me, that stand above me, that it's my job to discern and then, listen to, submit to, obey, if you will. Anyhow, I would be troubled by a person who says, it doesn't matter what intellectual norms other people think are valid. They're not valid for me. I don't care what kind of moral norms other people regard as valid. You might suppose that people deserve to be treated with respect and have their rights respected, or that their lives have a certain value. No.
Right.
I'll legislate everything and anything, and it's entirely up to me. I don't walk around talking about Satanism very much, but that that's sometimes been the picture of prideful unwillingness to submit to anything. And anyhow, you can see how my form of humility would be the antidote, the kind of flip side, the corresponding virtue to that vice.
Right.
And so, there's a form of pride, and I think you can see that an element, episodes of that kind of pride. I see it in myself sometimes, right? I just don't want to submit to the standard. I want to do what's in my interest, what's going to enhance my reputation, what's going to do well for me, but maybe not the other person. I can see little movements of will in myself, that kind of pride, and I'm troubled by it in me when I see it, and I suspect it's other people find in themselves. So there is a kind of notion of pride that I won't defend. Whereas there are also, of course, notions of pride, like Roberts, to go back to him, that I would, do I have a strong sense that I matter morally and that I matter as much as Justin Vacula, and on the flip side, Justin Vacula's life matters morally as much as mine? Absolutely. And so, for instance, the kind of respect grounded in your own and my own moral value, I have no trouble with, right? If that's, you want to call that pride, no problem. If you want to call pride a basketball player's sense that, he really does a skillful basketball sense that he has, grace and athleticism, if it's well grounded, esteem in his real skill, I have no trouble with that. So there are forms of pride I have no problem with, and you can certainly have that kind of pride and be humble in my sense. So again, there are plenty of notions of pride that fit with my notion of humility. You can submit yourself to the standards of athletic ideals, practicing hard and working on your skills and noticing weaknesses in your games, and getting into the gym to work on those, and then notice that you have, and if you feel a pride in that, there's no inconsistency between that pride and the claim that you've humbly submitted yourself to whatever other standards. So.
Right. And with performance or skill, there's going to be some sort of outside standard, because the athlete, the performer, could always say, oh, well, it's just my bad luck, or they'll blame some external factor as, well, the reason I didn't play well today is because it was maybe too windy, or because, they didn't give me a chance to be in the game, or, it was something that happened in the morning. But there are a lot of factors that go with that. And if they're just going to blame everyone else and not take accountability, there's humility of, actually, there are these external standards. There are people more skillful than me. Here are things I can do to improve, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the kind of nice things about one of the Seneca quotations. There's in Seneca, an unwillingness to bullshit himself, unwillingness to rationalize, right? Unwillingness to blame everything else but self, right? Oh, well, there was just too much wind today, so I couldn't play ball the way I normally do, or, my teammates just didn't give me the ball enough, or whatever. Those things occasionally can be true, but those have the air of rationalizations, right? And there's kind of unwillingness to see yourself coldly, according to more sensible, more fair-minded standards. I mean, and so Seneca says, well, look at yourself. You claim to have spent so much time pursuing wisdom, but haven't you just tossed a few hours at it? There's kind of, have you really done all, lived up to the real standards at play here? There's a kind of, to be humble in this sense is among other things, to be unwilling to be unwilling to be too often rationalizing and BSing yourself in that way. No, I didn't live up. I didn't do what was necessary. And again, there's kind of a humility in Seneca's or in that thought.
Yeah, he writes here, none of us goes deep below the surface. We skim the top only, and we regard the smattering of time spent in the search for wisdom as enough to spare for a busy man. What hinders us most of all is that we are too readily satisfied with ourselves. Right.
Sponville talks this way about us, our moral lives, and I don't really fully disagree with this. I have kind of a St. Paul, Pascal, Kantian strain in me that does the same thing, is that Spon wants to say, so how often is when we think that we're patient or generous or tolerant, how often are we really? Let's take a cold, hard look at the real standards of tolerance or patience, and I don't think we do so well. And hence he starts talking about profound moral dissatisfaction with self. Again, he tends to turn that into talk about informed contempt for self. I'm uncomfortable with the word contempt there, but he feels, we really stare at, he's an atheist, Sponville is, in his metaphysics, but he's got a very New Testament style moral outlook. And he says that if loving your neighbor as yourself is really the true moral standard, so we ought to be, unswervingly just and even more merciful and charitable than just. When we really look at ourselves, we're not going to do all that well. And I don't actually disagree with that judgment. I mean, I think we probably do fall far short of ideal standards of justice and charity, even very thoughtful and sensible standards of, we don't have to exaggerate the idealism. And we still, I think, will fall quite short. I just don't treat that as there's a kind of humility that misses, the kind that I'm trying to point to. So he turns that kind of strong self-dissatisfaction into his notion of humility, his central notion of humility.
Right. So with your take on it, it's the recognition of some sort of outside standards, systems, guidance. But on his, you can say, oh, well, you haven't done this. Oh, look, you've overlooked this. Or, oh, there's this injustice going on in the world. And, oh, you could do more. You could do more, as this person can always be pointing the finger. Although at some point there might be a cap for those demands and what can you reasonably expect from someone. But I suppose your take avoids those sort of objections in that, oh, well, maybe we don't have these moral failings all the time, or it's not such a tremendous cloud over.
The thought I have about this is it gets us a little away from the talk of humility, which is maybe okay. Like, I see in some moralists like Pascal, it happens a little bit in Spinoza, moral registers. At times they'll talk in extremely idealistic terms and then be extremely critical of self or critical of the moral character of human beings. And I think there is in the moral life room for that, an important place for, not being willing to rationalize and bullshit yourself too much. Sponville talks about our pathetic good consciences. We feel like we're decent people even as we watch, we stand by while lots of suffering and injustice happens.
Right.
We ignore so much, And I think there is a crucial role in the moral life of, taking the very ideal standards, idealistic as they are, looking at our saying, my goodness, how far do we fall short from those standards? I think there's a role for that. There's also a role in the moral life, though, to holding ourselves to much more, let's just say, manageable standards. To take the courtroom example earlier, let's say that you have ascended to the stand and testified and held yourself to standards of honesty and testified it honestly. It's not that relevant to say, well, Justin has told some lies. He's not a perfectly honest person who never lies. Or Reitsma for that matter, of course, right? So sometimes it makes sense to judge ourselves from ordinary standards. Hey, I did well here. I was honest on the stand, or I'm a fairly patient person. But so we can sometimes operate judging ourselves from ordinary or more manageable standards, and sometimes from much more rigorous ones. And I think there's important roles that both of those practices have in life. And so I'm not, when Sponville gets really hard on us. I grew up in Calvinist circles, and so I'm kind of grow up used to, serious, censorious moral language popping up from time to time. And how are you doing? You're falling so far short. But again, I have a little bit of a taste for that being a part of my life, even as I think it's sometimes descend from extremely idealistic standards and hold ourselves, in some contexts, to much weaker ones. So
right.
So alongside that, I've even written articles that have justified certain kinds of cheating in sports. So I know I'm not just, censorious all the time. I don't hold myself only to hyper-idealistic standards.
Right. So we can come to terms with our limitations, our lack of resources, and understand that we're not moral paragons, that maybe, to go with the Stoic theme, we can try to make a really good effort about things and be careful about what we do, but occasionally we're going to err, occasionally we're going to make mistakes, and we could recognize that and work to improve, right? The change isn't going to happen overnight. Right.
And if we wallow too much in our horrible character, it might be self-prophetic, right?
Right.
You might be less able to advance in the moral life if you just say, oh, what I just did is probably not as good as I thought. Oh, what I just did is probably not as good as I just thought. And so again, I think it's complex to live a moral life. And on my count, you do need some standards that you've committed to and then humbly live by. And it also matters to me, as you've kind of alluded a few times, what those standards are. It matters quite a lot to me what those standards are. Just any old standards. I don't want anybody treating just any old standards as authoritative. But I treat humility, by the way, as similar to courage. Courage is an important virtue, but people can sometimes act courageous for the unjust end.
Right.
And so courage needs to be shaped by practical wisdom. I think humility has a similar kind of character. Is that to be humble is important, but it's very, very crucial, of course, that you be committed to standards that are themselves highly defensible.
Right, not just any
morally good standards, intellectually credible standards.
We're coming on the end of our discussion, so any final thoughts on the topic, or maybe some projects that you're working on now?
Yeah, well, a few things. One thing, if your listeners kind of want to go and look at what I've been talking about, Sponville has a chapter on humility in the book I mentioned earlier, A Small Treatise on the Great Virtues. And Robert Roberts, we didn't talk about him as much as we might have today, which is fine, but he has, again, I think his chapter is called Humility as a Moral Project, and so he tries to also give advice about how to advance in humility in the midst of a life. And he has his view, he's writing sometimes for a Christian audience, and so his advice sort of reflects that. And then, if you want to find my couple of articles on humility, I'll post the most recent one in the next few days. They're on my academia.edu page under Regan Lance Reitsma. So,
and I'll link that in the show notes as well. Yes.
All right, sounds good. And so I'm hoping to kind of now I've written two critical pieces about Roberts and Sponville. It's really time for me now to to generate my positive account, and I'm hoping in the next month or so to start sending, off to journals my own positive account, kind of a longer journal-style article on this. But I'll be working on this in the next couple of months.
All right, very good. And that's academia.edu, Regan Lance Reitsma. And you're also at kings.edu as well. And where can people reach you if they would like to email or contact you?
So it's my email address is my full name, Regan Reitsma, so ReganReitsma, and then at kings.edu. So.
All right.
And I'd be happy to hear. Thanks a lot for a chance to talk about all this.
Yep. All right. Thanks for joining me today.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more content. Visit my website at justinvacula.com, where you can find links to my social portals, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and see past content on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please share, comment, like, and subscribe. Consider donating if you support my work and would like to see more, for this takes time, money, and effort to produce content. Support me on my patreon.com page, on which I offer several rewards. Have a great day.